All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta, and today is a special day. We're having a special episode today. We're doing books. It's Christmas, or Christmas. It's not yet Christmas. Christmas is coming up. So I got a bunch of books out there for us to learn about and maybe put them on your Christmas list. All right, we'll dive right in. As always, you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor. Get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Share it with your friends. Hit like. Drop a comment. Push me up on the algorithm. We'll jump right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, so this will be a little different. This is the only thing we're going to talk about today, and we're just going to talk about a bunch of books. And I'm doing this because, well, Christmas, as I said in the intro, Christmas is coming up. And if you have a history nerd or something like that, or if you are a history nerd and you want to know something to have on your list, well, here's your thing, right? Here's something to put on your Christmas list, or here's something to put in somebody's stocking or whatever. All right. And I will caveat all of this by saying, first of all, these aren't the only books on the subjects that I'm about to discuss. Certainly not. These may not even be the best books, frankly. Most of them are. Most of them are really good, right? But they're not the only books. And then finally, they're not, I don't always agree with the things that these books say. I agree with most of them, right? But I felt that it was important for us to have a sort of wide variety of books to reference out there, right? I can really only say a couple of things about these books. Number one, I have read them, and number two, I recommend them. So that's about it, right? But I've divided them up into sort of the categories that we've been talking about in the podcast to date, and so we'll just roll right in with them, right? So the first section of books is what I'll call sort of general books. So these general books cover things like war, society, strategy, and that kind of stuff, right? So these again are in no particular order, but we'll start with some classics. Right? The first one is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Obviously a famous book. You know, people have translated it into The Art of War for Business, whatever. But Sun Tzu really summarizes, the practices of war for those that are going to be serious about making war, right? There are multiple translations, there are multiple versions of this book, and much like the next book we're going to talk about, right, translations are always a problem. I happen to have the Ralph Sawyer translation, which was pretty good. The other recommended version is the Thomas Cleary translation. Both of these are very good. You can find them pretty much everywhere. The thing to know about Sun Tzu is this book was written or articulated, maybe is the best way to put it, right? We don't know that Sun Tzu was the guy that actually wrote this down, rather that this was wisdom that he passed along to his king, to his leader during the Warring States period in China. And these are maxims, truisms, right, of fighting war, right? And what is interesting to note is that Sun Tzu goes, in my opinion, a long way to avoid war in his advice to warriors and leaders. And he also makes the connections between the leadership and the army, the people, and and again, we'll jump right into talking about this with other writers as well, right? But then noting the importance and the connection between politics, war making, and the society in which it exists. So if you haven't read it, it's a classic. This is one of the foundational books that you got to know if you're going to talk about war. You just got to have your Sun Tzu quotes ready, right? The next one, Karl von Clausewitz, Crazy Karl Depression. Karl von Clausewitz on war. This is arguably one of the more well-known books as well, but also one of the more controversial ones out there. What makes Clausewitz's book both well-known and controversial is that it's very raw. Clausewitz died before he finished writing this book, and it's very esoteric in its logic, right? One of the mechanisms that Clausewitz uses to make his points is he sort of says something very absolute, and then he spends the next little bit tearing that absolute idea down. It's a sort of inverse argument format, which makes it sort of difficult to follow, but basically what Clausewitz is arguing is like, listen, there's nothing absolute in war. He talks about fog and friction and all of these sort of unknowable things about war. But like Sun Tzu, he talks about these maxims, right? The people, the connection between the people or the society, the politicians, the leaders, and the army itself that's doing the fighting, and the importance of having those things, right? And the unity of those things being, essential to winning. Clausewitz, unlike Sun Tzu, takes a very sort of offensive approach to war fighting, where Sun Tzu takes what we'll call indirect approach to war fighting. But nevertheless, there are a lot of similarities, in my opinion, between those two works, despite the fact that they're, several, roughly 1,000 years separated from each other, right? I think the best version, translated version, again, Clausewitz is, all these are translated. The Michael Howard and Peter Perret version is arguably the most famous and the best version. There are others out there, but this is the one that I would recommend for anybody that wants to get serious about it. So those are the two sort of classic works on war and war making, right? Another one that I would recommend, just sort of as a general overview of the ideas of strategy, is called the new Makers of Modern Strategy. There is a Makers of Modern Strategy, again written by Peter Perret. His name pops up from time to time, often on these sorts of books. But this new Makers of Modern Strategy, edited by Hal Brands, basically goes from ancient times to modern times and covers the key players and sort of their ideas behind strategy, right? We're talking Thucydides, Machiavelli, all the way up to nuclear strategy, counterterrorism, terrorism, insurgencies, cyber war, etc., and everything in between. This is a hefty book, not gonna lie, but it's digestible into sort of, the chapters are 20 to 30 pages long, and so you can sort of read them in a quick sitting and work your way through history and sort of get not only the interesting makers of strategy, right, but sort of a lot of, we'll call it background data on things that happened historically speaking, right? So interesting book. I think it's one of those that if you're going to be serious about studying war, knowing about war, and having context for what's going on in the world, this is one of those books that you need to read, right? Again, staying in the general category, we'll move to one called War, How Conflict Shaped Us by Margaret Macmillan. She's also somebody who will appear regularly on this list, let's say. This book is, again, it talks about the sort of tie of society and war, and how war is this human experience that you can't really get away from, and it just existed as long as humans have existed, and sort of the good, bad, and ugly essential parts of war and war making. All right. Again, it's a gigantic. This is actually an easy book to read, but it covers a lot of ground, and I think It's provides an important context, really, and this is all the sort of things I think that these books do, is provide some context to the larger fray. And finally, sort of in this general war in society, if you will, or the ties of humans in warfare, is a book called Tribe by a guy named Sebastian Junger. He's not a historian. This is not really a historical book. This is a really small, quick read sort of book. And the thing that I find the most interesting about this book is it's sort of a individual human examination of war and war fighting and what it's like to recover from war and come back from war, right? It really, Junger produced a documentary called Restrepo, and he wrote a book about the similar thing, and mostly about the war in Afghanistan. This talks a lot about the war in Afghanistan, this particular book, Tribe. And it talks about homecoming from war and sort of how humans have dealt with warriors after they've been scarred by the war and war making, and what modern society does with it. I think it's super interesting to read, and I think it's important to understand what warriors go through and how they recover from having fought a war. All right, so those are sort of the general categories. We'll move then to one of the categories we've talked about a lot around here, the Middle East. So the first one is the Middle East, A History, the 6th edition, but whatever, by Sidney Fisher and William, I'm going to mess his name up, apologies, William Oschenwald. Again, this is a broad brush history that goes way back, comes pretty close to modern. The latest version was written in 2003, so it's not going to get all the way up to today, but it's going to bring us into that sort of the depth and background and then sort of breadth of all the various nations involved in the Middle East, and how those foundations, for everything from religion, economics, colonialism, etc., society, played into the nations of the Middle East. So again, a good just sort of general overview for understanding what's going on out there in the Middle East. Zooming in a little bit to a nation that's been, we'll say, forefront of action in the Middle East recently. This one's by Homa Katsuzan, and it's the Persians, ancient, medieval, and modern Iran. Again, zooming in on Iran and its ancient history. Iran is one of the oldest nations or sort of societies in the world. Deep roots, obviously. The Persian Empire conquered a huge swath of territory in their day, and so this is going to walk us through the history of what is the modern nation of Iran and how it came to be. Again, very important, I think, to understanding the Middle East as a whole, just that zooming in on Iran specifically. And then finally, rounding out my Middle East recommendations, the Arab-Israeli conflict by Thomas Fraser. Again, right, just zooming in on the sort of establishment of Israel as a state, and then the conflict that broke out as around it. It goes back into history and talks about some of the historical roots of conflict in this neighborhood of the Middle East, particularly in Israel and the Holy Land, right? And touches on all of Israel's neighbors and those that have been in conflict with it. Again, right, like delving into those social, cultural, religious, nationality understandings of nations in the Middle East and how important all those things are. So those are my recommendations for books in the Middle East. Again, right, the idea here is just to bring us a broad swath of information on all of them. Moving over to another discussion that we've had a lot here, specifically zooming in on China. The first one is an overall history of China. This is, in my opinion, one of the best one-volume series histories of China. It's called China, A History. It's by Dr. Harold Tanner, who coincidentally happened to be on my dissertation committee, so thanks to him. But I really do think that this is one of the best books on China, and if you want to just one read that's accessible, that goes back in time to give us enough depth to understand where the modern Chinese state comes from. Relatedly, Making China Modern is another book that talks about a more modern section of China and the struggle of Mao to bring China from this sort of rural backwater to a modern industrial state, and all the good, bad, and ugliness that came along with it, and sort of talks about how does China become the modern state that it is. So those two books together, I recommend that. And a second one that I would recommend to sort of give us some context on how particularly the United States and the Chinese, particularly the Chinese communists, interact since the founding of the CCP, is a unique book. It's called Mission to Mao by Dr. Sarah Castro. And this book covers the first interactions sort of between the official U.S. government and the Chinese communists during World War II. And Mission to Mao was this what's called the Dixie Mission, and they went to out where the Chinese communist base of operations was, and were gathering intelligence on the Japanese during World War II and sort of learning how to interface with the Chinese communists. It highlights a lot of the political, military, intelligence, ideological, cultural tensions between the U.S. and China, and sort of helps you understand a little bit about why China behaves the way that it does towards Americans, and why Chinese government thinks the way that it does about the U.S. government. So just a general overview. And then this last book is not specifically about China, but the point is really driven towards the U.S.-Chinese conflict, particularly in the South China Sea. And this book is called Near and Far Waters by Colin Flint. And it's a super unique take, I think, on how countries see themselves and what they do relative to the things that are important to them, and how countries project power. This is a sea power-based book, so for all you people that like boats out there, this is your jam. But realistically, it addresses the sort of modern conflict in the South China Sea and why the United States is behaving in a certain way and why the Chinese are behaving in a certain way, particularly around the South China Sea. Again, power politics is all at play here, right? So that's my recommendations for China. Moving on to the Russians and / the Soviet Union. The first one, The New Cold War, Putin's Russia and the Threat to the West by Edward Lucas. Again, a little bit provocative. This was a 2009 book, so it doesn't bring us all the way up to the modern things, but, again, delving into like how Putin sees the world, what he is aggrieved about, for lack of a better way to put it, how he came to power, etc. Right? In really kind of talking through what it is that Russia is up to, why they engage with the West in the way that they do, and sort of what buttons they are attempting to push to sort of regain power, as it were. Right. A second one, and this is really sort of esoteric, frankly, but I think sort of important to understand about how the Russian military operates. We've talked a little bit about that. And this one is A Military History of Russia from Ivan the Terrible to the War in Chechnya by David Stone. Again, another book that sort of delves into how the Russians, Soviets, and now Russians again, operated, how they see war, what they do with war, how the Russian society / Soviet society integrates with war. I think there's a lot of things at play here. We're going to get to more Cold War related stuff here in a little bit, but these are the two books I think I would recommend. That I would recommend as it pertains specifically to Russia or the Soviet Union. All right, jumping into more specific war stuff. We'll touch on some World War I and then World War II books. So, starting off with World War I again, right? I've said this before. I'll say it again. You can't really underestimate the importance of World War I on world history. So here's a couple of books I think are really good for understanding this dynamic. The first one is The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. And this one talks about the leaders of the various nations that bring us into World War I and how they are complicit in very actively pursuing war in some cases in the 1914 and the years immediately preceding 1914 and the events that lead us to World War I breaking out. The second one is called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. And this one, again, covers that, like, how do we even get into this war? What are the things that start, and how does the war initiate, in both from a political and a military stance perspective. This is both of these books, in my opinion, are sort of classic World War I books, especially The Guns of August. You know, if you are a serious historian of World War I, you have read The Guns of August and you have read The Sleepwalkers, right? Two books by Margaret Macmillan. Again, I told you she would appear on the list again later. The first one is called The War That Ended Peace, and the second one is called Paris 1919. Again, these talk about sort of the beginning and the end, if you will, of World War I. How do we get here? What happened? And then what is the aftermath of World War I? Again, all important things to understanding how and where we are as it relates to World War I. So those are what I would recommend for those. Moving to World War II, I have a couple of book series. These are trilogies, both of these. The first one is by Rick Atkinson. It's 3 books called An Army at Dawn, The Day of Battle, and Guns at Last Light. And they cover the war in the European theater, following primarily the U.S. Army in North Africa, then in Italy, and then in the Northern European theater. I think these are excellent books. They're very accessible to the average reader. They're not just hardcore histories, although they are good histories, in my opinion. The second one is a similar trilogy, the Pacific War Trilogy by a guy named Ian Toll, and it covers the naval war in the Pacific primarily from December 1941 all the way through August of 1945. Both of these series are excellent. They are hefty reads, not gonna lie. All 3 books in both of these sets are really thick and will take you a hot minute to finish, but they are well worth the time and effort that you're going to read. You're going to learn a lot about World War II that you did not know before, I promise, reading these books. The next book I would recommend relates specifically to air power, and this one is called Masters of the Air by Donald Miller. This one covers the 8th Air Force specifically fighting in World War II. An interesting read if you don't know much about the air war in World War II. I definitely recommend that one. Right? Obviously, it was famously made recently into a miniseries on Apple, which I found was to be really good and very, very true to the book. So recommend that as well to go with. All right, not the last one, but sort of war-specific one is Downfall, and this is the end of the Japanese, the end of the war as it is from the perspective of the Japanese. This really delves into the controversy of, like, should the U.S. have used the atomic bomb? What were all the politics and difficulties of the Japanese cabinet going through? How is this war unfolding in the Japanese homeland? All of these very complicated things that as Americans we don't often talk about, in my opinion, and sort of the backstory of how Japan came to the idea of surrender and all of the things that are going into that. Semi-controversial in some cases, but I think, again, very interesting there. Right. Moving on to things about aftermath of World War II, 8 Days at Yalta by Diane Preston and Potsdam, the end of World War II and Remaking of Europe by Michael Nyberg. Both of these books cover the Allied conferences related to the end of the war. If you do not know, there were several Allied conferences throughout the course of the war, beginning with the Atlantic Conference before the United States ever entered the war, and going all the way into Potsdam, which was the last Allied conference. And it was basically Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and then Truman at the end, after Roosevelt died, that went into shaping the policy for fighting the war and shaping the outcome of the war and then the post-war world. So this is kind of the construct of where we get our modern world order from. Again, just like World War I, in my opinion, right? You can't overstate the importance of this particular series of events, particularly from the Big Three leadership of the Allies. All right, moving on to another section here. This one zooms in a little bit on Afghanistan, so some more modern stuff. The first one is by Stephen Tanner, Afghanistan: A Military History from Alexander the Great to the Fall of the Taliban. The name of the book, in my opinion, describes it perfectly, right? Like, there are other books that cover similar topics. I'm not going to go into all those, but I think this one is really good. And the other one that's out there is In the Graveyard of Empires. But in any case, I like this one, again, covering the sort of backstory of Afghanistan, how it came to be in the forefront of this conflict, and what goes on in Afghanistan, and what's the military attempts to conquer this very difficult region to conquer. The second book is more recent, and I think really good. It covers the political sort of undertones of the campaign in Afghanistan, and also it covers the Taliban/Afghan perspective on the war. So this one's called The American War in Afghanistan. It's by Carter Malkasian, and it's an excellent book. Again, pretty hefty, but an excellent book on sort of all the political decisions that go into the war from the U.S.'s side, and similar political or cultural influences from the Taliban side. I think it's important to understand that conflict from that perspective. Moving back, I guess maybe kind of to the Cold War and the end of the Cold War. These are kind of all over the map, so I have a couple of them here. The first one is about the Korean War. It's called This Kind of War by T.R. Fernbach. This is a classic Korean War history book. If you want to know about the Korean War, you have to read this book. There are many others, right? But as one of the books that you read, you have to read the T.R. Fernbach book. It talks about fighting from the U.S. perspective in Korea, right? And the second one by Max Hastings, The Korean War. That's it, right? Again, very general overview of the Korean War. It covers both sides, both the Korean perspective, North and South, and the American/UN perspective of the war in a reasonably digestible for the average reader sort of format, right? Other war particular books in this list. The Vietnam War, A Military History by Jeffrey Warrow. This is a new book. It just came out a couple of months ago. I definitely recommend it. This is, quite frankly, one of the best, if not the best book on the Vietnam War that I've ever read. And I think that it covers the politics of the war in although unfavorable, in an unbiased look. It covers the military leadership. It covers the down to the dirty details, tactical fighting as well. So again, it's a excellent book. It's pretty hefty, not gonna lie, but it's readable. It goes fast, and it's very good. Definitely recommend it. All right, some more sort of general Cold War history books, and there's a bunch in here because I like the Cold War. And so, The Twilight Struggle by Hal Brands is a sort of U.S. strategy look at how the U.S. went about engaging in the Cold War. The Cold War by Odd Arne Wested, this is a hardcore academic book, and talks about like how global the Cold War really was, and all of their various players besides just the United States and the Soviet Union. And then The Cold War, A New History by John Lewis Gaddis, again, sort of looking at the various aspects of the Cold War from different perspectives, right? I think these three books encapsulating the various visions of the Cold War from different perspectives is important to capture exactly how A, global the Cold War was, and B, sort of deep and nuanced that it was. Some books that talk about the end of the Cold War, the first one being The Return of History by Robert Kagan. This is a book that's written in response to an article called The End of History, which sort of celebrated the end of the Cold War and basically saying, like, war's never going to exist again. And then Kagan, like, says, well, hold on there. Here are all the things that have been happening in the last few decades since the end of the Cold War, and it turns out we were totally wrong about assuming that peace was going to just break out after the Cold War happened, right? And so this sort of brings to light the current situation that we're in of this more realpolitik competitive world between the Russians, the Chinese, and the United States particularly on a global stage. The second one is America Between the Wars, which covers the sort of the moments between the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall most specifically, and the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, specifically 9/11. This is a really interesting concept of a book that covers just that sort of decade between those two events and just zooms in on U.S. hegemony in the world and U.S. folly as it relates to that hegemony. So, very interesting book, in my opinion. Definitely recommend it. Backing up to one that I forgot to talk about a second ago. Sorry. So on my list, also A Fiery Peace in a Cold War by Neil Sheehan. This talks about the bringing of the ballistic missile, the nuclear ballistic missile, to the existence, right? And again, it goes deep into sort of some of the mechanical, political, military machinations of the Cold War. So there goes a whole bunch of Cold War books for you to delve into. All right, last setup, and these are sort of American general books. These are mostly foreign policy type books. So take it or leave it. But the first one is a series of books called the Dangerous Nation series by Robert Kagan, another guy that's going to appear, right? And this, it's a little bit controversial, I'll just be frank, right? It talks about the United States being an aggressive, nay, verily, an imperial power in its foreign policy, and how the rise of the United States rose to global dominance. It's really interesting book. It's not negative, but it just takes a different tack than most sort of understandings of U.S. history. The second one, semi-related to that, and this, I'm not going to lie, this is a hardcore academic book, so if you're a hardcore academic, this one's for you. If you're not a hardcore academic, I recommend Dangerous Nation instead. This one is From Colony to Superpowers by George Herring, and this just covers U.S. foreign policy from the beginning till modern times, and it is a one-stop shop for understanding how the United States engages with the world, in my opinion. Right? Then some more generic books about the United States. The first one is really interesting concept for a book. It's called America's Constitution, a Biography by Akhil Amar. And it's basically like a biography written about the Constitution as if it were a person. It's a really interesting concept. It's like, how did the Constitution come to be? What's the backstory behind it? What are all the people that were involved in the life of in the creation of the Constitution? How is it involved over its existence? How have we translated it? How do we understand it? Again, just like sort of a broad sweep of the history of the existence of the Constitution. I think it's really interesting. Related to that is the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton and others, but Hamilton, as we all know, if you've seen the musical Hamilton or read it, he wrote most of them. The Federalist Papers, collection of writings in support of the Constitution, why the folks that wrote it thought that it was an important document for the existence of the United States, and sort of really, if you read into the Federalist Papers, in my opinion, it like delves into the genius, for lack of a better way to put it, in the creation of the Constitution. And then last, and again, this is one of the more complex and frankly a little bit controversial books on the list, but I think it's really good. It's called These Truths, and it's by Joe Lepore, and this is a single volume history of the United States, and it's, if you know anything about single volume histories of the United States, they're always controversial. One of the more controversial ones being the people's history of the United States. This one doesn't go quite to that extreme, but it does examine the idea of like, well, in the Constitution, in our founding documents, we talk about equality and liberty and all of these truths that we hold to be self-evident, right? And then how does the United States struggle with that across its history? And where do we have advances and where do we fall down? And I think it takes a really fair look at the struggles and victories and losses of the United States as a nation. So one last quick shameless self-promotion. You can always add my book to the list. Eagles Overhead, U.S. Air Force Forward Air Controllers, From the Meuse Argonne to Mosul. There you go. Those are my history nerd books for recommendation for all my history nerd friends out there. If you are one or if you have one, you can put some of these books on your Christmas list. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, hit the like button, tell your friends, drop a comment, follow me on Instagram and YouTube. And as always, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Have a good one.